active advice I remember him giving me.
He advised your first wife not to marry you?
He certainly advised my first wife not to marry me. Yes, that was a sound piece of advice also. One of the things which I greatly respected him for was that he became blind, which was a tragic thing, happening to him in the middle of a very successful legal career. So, you know, the end of his life was spent in darkness, and you would think, in a sort of dismal way, although he was always laughing at jokes, but it never caused him to turn to God. And I admired that.
He wanted you to become a barrister. Looking back on it, do you wish you'd spent rather more of your life writing rather than in the law?
Well, I never stopped writing. I was always writing. And there were times, you know, when I used to sit in long cases writing sketches for That Was the Week That Was, you know, underneath my exercise book. But it's something that's very difficult for me to tell. I think I stayed a barrister too long. But if I hadn't been a barrister, I wouldn't have written Rumpole. I wouldn't have met some rather charming murderers and some extremely nasty judges.
Now, as a barrister, especially in your criminal work, you had to be an advocate. Yeah. Isn't that really very different from the writer's stand of being an observer?
Absolutely. The trouble about being a barrister is you're always someone else. You're always your client. You're a kind of mask for your client, or you're a sort of puppet on a string. And you try and avoid the truth coming out if you're a defence barrister. You know, you think of all sorts of artful dodges to stop it happening. Whereas if you're a writer, you've got to be totally yourself. You've got to expose yourself exactly as you are, and you've got to try and find the truth. So they're diametrically opposed, as far as that's concerned.
Did you find it useful and helpful psychologically to have the two things going on at the same time then?
It was very helpful because I got to know a lot of people in very intimate ways. I mean, when I was very young, and my marriage was in a terrible state, you know, I was to leave home bleeding at the nose, my shirt torn, my car was stolen, I had thumb a lift to the temple, au pair girl was pregnant and left home, all these awful things were happening. And then I used to sit down and 60-year-old company directors would come and tell me all about their problems. And I would sit there and give them the most wonderful advice on exactly how they should conduct their married lives. And that was a very good training for a young writer. I mean, I got to be totally unshockable, and I got to know an awful lot about an awful lot of people, and not only know about their circumstances, but know how they spoke in moments of crisis.
When your father died, you wrote the very successful television and stage play Voyage Round My Father in memory of him, and it showed how he and your mother just carried on as normal a life as possible, not referring to his blindness at all. What did your mother think about being written about in that way?
Oh, she hated it. She thought it was absolutely awful. She thought I should never have done it. It was disgraceful. It was terrible to mention our family in public.
Do you regret having written the play, looking back on it?
No, not at all. If you are a writer, it's a sort of a curse, and it's particularly a curse to anybody who happens to live with you or be associated with you, because they're bound to find themselves in a book sooner or later. So you never keep your experiences. That's in a way the sad thing about my father and that play. That's the only thing I regret about it, is that other people still have got their fathers. My father has gone off into the public domain, and he's acted, he's read, and he doesn't really belong privately to me. That's the only sad thing.
That seems to me to be a terrible price.
It is. It is. There are other rewards. The other rewards are that there's nothing ever happens which isn't useful to you and interesting to you, and you never stop working.
You first began to write scripts when you worked for the Crown Film Unit during the war, making, in effect, propaganda films.
Yes, exactly.
I can't really imagine you doing that.
I couldn't imagine me doing it anyway. I got the job as a fourth assistant director, and I was the person who had to say quiet please at the beginning of every shot. And I had to say quiet please in a very humble, nervous voice, and they went on making love and hammering and playing pontoon. And then I yelled at them, "Quiet, you bastards," and they all went on strike. The people in the Crown family said, "Well, you're clearly a disaster as a fourth assistant director, so you've better become the scriptwriter." And Laurie Lee was the scriptwriter. And I'll be always grateful to him, because he told me how to write a script and then left rapidly. And so I had that job, and the use of it to me was that I then learned how to write film scripts.
In the 60s and 70s, you gained a certain amount of fame through your work on the anti-censorship trials. I was thinking of the Oz magazine trial in which you defended the publishers, I think, against the charge of obscenity. And, of course, defended Gay News in the case brought against it by Mrs. Whitehouse. Are you opposed still to any form of censorship, whatever?
I came to the conclusion that the dangers of censorship are worse than the dangers of freedom in that respect. Any sort of censorship law, I think, can be used by governments and is used by governments not to suppress things which they think are too sexy or too vulgar or whatever, but to suppress things which they find politically undesirable. So I think that the dangers of censorship are worse than the dangers of free speech. That's what I think. But it's a very nice balance. And if you abolish censorship, it would not be an undangerous thing to do.
When you interviewed Malcolm Muggeridge, I remember he said to you that the fallacy of the liberal mind was that it sees good in everything. Do you accept that now?
Yes, I think it may be so, but I don't think that that is a particular fallacy, and I think that if you're a Christian, as Malcolm Muggeridge undoubtedly is, you should think that's rather a desirable thing to see good in everything. I do think that may be my fault. I mean, I go and interview people who I meant to do a terrible hatchet job on, and I even find a sort of sneaking affection for Norman Tebbit overcoming me.
Of the people you've interviewed, who impressed you most, or who was the most interesting, do you think?
Well, the most interesting, I think, was Enoch Powell. I mean, the most impressive thing that I ever heard, or perhaps the saddest thing, was I asked him if he liked music, and he said, well, he played a lot of music when he was young, but he never played it now. And I asked him why, and he said, because it doesn't do to awaken unfulfillable desires, which I thought was a very sad and wonderful remark. And when I interviewed Lord Hailsham, I said, what do you do when you get terribly bored on the woolsack and you can't stand it? And he said, I mutter bollocks to the bench of bishops. Well, once, he's admitted that he whispers bollocks to the bench of bishops, you're okay. So they were all fine. And I really like bishops best of all the people. I like doing religious interviews.
One of the things that struck me in the religious interviews you did, with the exception of the interview with the Bishop of London, who's very definite about everything, was that you got quite unsatisfactory answers about any major question you put to them about the problem of evil.
Very. I mean, I find that both a terrific bar to believing in God, and yet it opens up an argument which in a way does lead to God. Because I can't understand an omnipotent God who allows children to die of leukemia, 7 million Jews to be gassed, people going to church in South America to be buried in mud, and so on. That is a thing that I can't understand. There's a remark in the Evelyn Waugh diaries about Randolph Churchill when he was ill and had nothing to read, so he read the Old Testament, and he looked up and said, incredible bastard God was, and it seems to me to be an accurate summing up of his behaviour. And I just read the book of Job, in which God behaves appallingly. I mean, all the tormenting of poor old Job is done out of some sort of bet with Satan. And so I find God very difficult to excuse, and that if God existed, I wouldn't like him. Once you begin saying that, once you begin saying you dislike God, then you've got to dislike something that exists, which is in a way a religious position, I suppose.
How would you describe your religious position now?
Well, I mean, there are two sides to religion, aren't there? I mean, there's the side which is to do with some mystic content in the universe, and there's the side which is to do with morality and ethics and good behaviour. And the side which is to do with morality and ethics and good behaviour, I think, is very well answered by Christianity. I think that the Christian belief in the importance of the individual person is a most enormous historical step forward, and something which we should absolutely cleave to. The idea that every single person is of enormous importance in the eye of eternity is absolutely vital. And so therefore I think that all the Christian ethic is vitally important. But but if you then have that without believing in God, what you're missing is a mystic feeling of some mystic reality in the universe. And the nearest I can get to that, I think, is in the sort of Wordsworthian pantheism feeling about something far more deeply interfused in nature, and I can understand that. But it doesn't take one very far, and you can just feel a sort of soppy pantheist.
Going back to the question you raised about the problem of evil, do you think you might be asking the wrong question? You ask why God allows 7 million Jews to be gassed, and so on. Isn't that rather like blaming God for people doing the things that he does not wish to be done?
Yes, but if you see, the whole business of free will is a very, very difficult one for God, isn't it? I mean, if he is an omnipotent God, a God who can control the universe, and then he allows people free will, for what purpose? For the purpose of them adhering to him, of having the choice to adhere to him or not. Well, that seems a kind of vanity in a way to me. I suppose the fault of that is that you're judging God as a human being. But that's the only way that I can judge him as a human being. I'm not an expert in the morality of gods. I rather prefer the old Greek gods who were just selfish and came down and have it off with somebody, instead of all this very elaborate kind of cat and mouse game about giving someone free will in order that they can then gas a lot of children in order to prove how unselfish you are to give them free will in the first place.
Don't you think that morality is really rather a boring notion compared with the Christian idea of grace? The idea that you are loved not because of what you do, but you are loved anyway, and then your life becomes a response to this, which seems to me to be a marvellously exciting idea, much more interesting than mere morality.
The word morality can be indescribably boring. I mean, morality in the sense that Mrs. Whitehouse would use the word is more so boring it hardly bears thinking about. And if morality is a kind of hard code of conduct which doesn't admit of any exceptions, which is applied rigorously, of course it's totally stupid and often immoral and very nearly always unkind. But if what you mean by morality is what I take to be the Christian ethic, that we must love one another or die, that every single individual is of huge importance, and that your own ethics must mean that you don't do unnecessary harm to other people, and that you're not selfish, and so on, those things, then I think that isn't boring. I think it's quite hard and quite exciting, and it is forever exciting to try and produce a society which has those values at heart. Now, the idea of grace, which is a very beautiful idea, and particularly beautiful in the way that you've put the question, I suppose depends on the existence of God, because you can't believe in Christian grace unless you believe in the love of God. And if you don't happen to believe in a God, I suppose that's one of the fine advantages of life which are beyond me.
Morality seems to me to imply ought to, which, compared with loving, is awfully second-rate, isn't it? I mean, it's something you fall back on when you, for one reason or another, find it hard to love.
Well, I suppose morality it's a very degraded word, and I think probably the good in society can come from a kind of idea of decency which isn't necessarily to do with love. The idea that life should be decent and honourable and fair. Actually, I think Oscar Wilde had a very good basis for socialism. He said the great advantage of a socialist state is that it saves you the frightful bore of having to feel sorry for everybody all the time. And I think actually that's quite. You can get on with your life. You don't have to sort of go around loving the poor or anything because they're being well looked after.
Do you find that your religious views are changing all the time, or have they been fairly static for a while?
My views are much closer to Christianity now than they started out by being. I would hate anything to happen to Christianity. Christianity has emerged very well in the modern world, and I think the bishops have stood for great good in our society. I think that the church throughout the world has been a great benefit and power for good in South America and Africa and so on. I would hate any of that to go, and I would hate the village not to have a church, you know. So therefore I'm extremely in favour of Christianity being supported. And I wouldn't have any bishops to interview.
Well, the main purpose of the church is to provide bishops for you to interview.
Yes, that's why I like when I congratulated a jury at the Old Bailey for sitting through one of the most boring cases in the whole history of the English law. And the judge began his summing up to the jury, and he said, "It may come as a considerable surprise to you, members of the jury. Note the sole purpose of the criminal law of England is not to entertain Mr. Mortimer." So probably it isn't the sole purpose of the Christian religion to entertain me and provide me with bishops to laugh at.
Do you ever long for the idea of a God as judge, as the celestial
Absolutely.
Lord High Justice?
That was the main thing that would put me off him, send me running to... I mean, I can't bear human judges. I certainly couldn't stand a celestial one. I think judgment is one of the worst weaknesses of human nature. If we get away from judging people, I think we should be infinitely better off.
I suppose your most successful writing, in terms certainly of commercial sales, has been the stories about Rumpole, your, I think, marvellous comic and noble hero, the barrister. Do you think that Rumpole sees things as a great drama of good and evil?
Well, his sort of good and evil, yes, I think he does. I mean, Rumpole has certain things that he believes in, very unfashionable things, like, you know, the law, the presumption of innocence, the right to be tried by a jury. He's against judging, you see. I mean, he always says there, "But for the grace of God goes Rumpole," which is what I always thought in court the entire time. Yeah. So he's got that, but I don't know whether you really call that morality. He finds a lot easy to forgive, but not judicial cruelty.
Rumpole, of course, has been televised very successfully, and Paradise postponed.
Yeah.
A lot of your novels was televised. That was a re-examination of the state of English rural and political life since the war.
Yeah.
Starting with this startling news that a left-wing country rector has left shares worth, it's thought, about £2 million in a local, rather odious young Tory MP.
Tory MP, yeah. I think I'm going to write another novel about him. But, I mean, really, you know, quite rude about the Conservatives, right? Very rude about sort of rich left-wing people as well. So I set out to be as rude about my own beliefs as I was about anybody else's.
Yes, the rector comes off pretty badly, really. His CND marching ideals, which seem to change not very much, and nobody in particular.
I don't think you should judge people's beliefs by their behaviour. I mean, I don't think the fact that such a lot of Christians have been so horrible as should really be held to the account of Christianity.
What is the paradise that you imagine has been postponed?
Oh, well, the paradise then was the paradise we were promised after the war, you know, the paradise of the Labour landslide in 1945, that we were going to have a society which unemployment wouldn't exist any longer, rich and poor wouldn't exist any longer, there'd never be any more conservatives. We'd all enter into the just city. I mean, whether that's a paradise anybody particularly wants, perhaps it isn't.
What is the paradise you want?
Well, I don't want paradise, certainly. I think paradise would be unbelievably tedious, which is why I don't want to have immortality. You know, my father said, you know, a terrible idea, like living in some huge transcendental hotel with nothing to do in the evening. But what I would like is to live in England as it is, with a little bit more social justice, equality, reasonable treatment of everybody. That's what I'd like. I mean, it wouldn't be paradise, it would be better.
The book, I suppose, highlights two main ways of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Is it better to hope for paradise even if it is unattainable?
That's right.
Or to accept that life is nasty,
exactly.
brutish and short and go out for
I believe
yourself?
Totally in the first view. I mean, I think, too, that's a good thing to think about religion. It doesn't really matter whether God exists, in a sense. if you live a better life and are kinder to people, and so on, assuming that he does, then that's enough reason for it. It is infinitely better to find good in things, even if it isn't there, perhaps. To act on that assumption, to act on the assumption that the world can be better, and then you're liable to do something, maybe. But if you act on the assumption that we're all nasty, brutish and short, and you better make as much money on the stock exchange before the crash comes, then it's not going to be a very pleasant world.
You've spoken of what you see as Britain's bizarre religion of greed at the moment. That's quite a strong attack on Britain today.
Yes. Well, I think it's a pretty disgusting situation. I mean, the idea that money is the entire be-all and end-all of existence, that everything now is judged by whether or not you make money. Education is judged. We're meant to be educated. People are meant to be educated simply in order to make money. The idea that you're educated in order to be a more tolerable person or to lead a richer life when you're sitting by yourself has totally gone.
You once said that a deeply pessimistic view of the human condition is an excellent recipe for a happy life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't believe in immortality, therefore I believe that, our life is very short, a ludicrously short period, so you're going, which I think gives it much more importance. Every minute is very precious, which it isn't to people, or certainly wasn't to people who believed in that the important part of living would go on after you were dead. So therefore I think that. Also I think it's very important not to expect too much and then you get pleasantly surprised. I mean, all my clients that I've ever appeared for, I've always told them, the case was going to be a disaster, they'll probably go to prison for 10 years and so on, and they get fined 5 bob and they're absolutely over the moon. I think it's a very sensible way of proceeding.
In your interviews, you nearly always ask people whether they think much about dying. Do you?
Yes. I do. I find it very, very irritating. And, I can resent it deeply. But I suppose there's nothing very much to be done about it.
In Writers Revealed, John Mortimer was in conversation with Rosemary Harthill, the producer David Coombs. Next week, Rosemary Harthill will be talking to the Jewish novelist and Booker Prize winner Bernice Rubens. A fuller version of all the conversations can be found in a BBC paperback. It's called Writers Revealed and is published by BBC Publications at £5.99.